So we're just gonna look at losses and then do a question as usual. And then you guys can ask me any questions if you have related to process costing. So we make sure that we've written it down and we are all on the same page. There's certain rules that will apply probably with losses. So I just want to ask a question. It's the first time that you join the class, how it normally works. We go through the theory. I'll choose one of you or anyone can volunteer to give us how they approached the question, the practice question that we've done.
Okay, I think
Yes.
normal losses are something that you don't plan for something to happen. Say you bake bread and the machine breaks where the dough must mix in. I think this is a stupid example, but yeah, that's what I can come up now. And then abnormal is when somebody sabotages the machine. That's what I think it is.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that one. And others, what are your inputs? What do you understand to be a normal loss and abnormal loss? And what's the difference between it? You can use examples, as Magdalena did.
An example of normal loss, according to me, is maybe, for an example, when you're baking and then all the cakes come okay and then only one pan burns. I would say that is the normal loss. And then abnormal loss, I'm not sure.
Okay. Everyone likes.
Let me try.
Yes.
I think a normal loss is it's when I'll make an example. Maybe in manufacturing, I don't know when they manufacture what, maybe medication. I don't know how they do it, but maybe it evaporates.
Okay.
And then obviously if initially they measured 100 mils and then it ends up on 90 mils, then that 10%, that 10 mils that have been lost during evaporation, I think that is normal loss. And then when we are maybe we are in the process and then maybe we have load shedding and then our medication doesn't end up complete and then we end up throwing it away, then that is an abnormal loss. I don't know if that is fine. I think, I'm not sure if this is the exact question that you ask. I think the normal loss is the loss that we know that we might occur. And then the abnormal loss is something that we are not sure it will occur. Maybe it's something that comes once in a while.
Yes. Okay. I like that. So everyone, thank you for your participation and contribution. You are correct. So normal loss is something that is unavoidable, right? Loss is something that is inherent in the manufacturing process. It's a natural part of the process. You cannot avoid them. It does not indicate that the process that you have it's ineffective. So it's normal. So I like the idea of when you are producing, it might be a liquid or oil where you are using chemicals. When you apply heat to those chemicals, which is part of making that oil, I'm making an example, and then you compress it into liquid. There are chances that a part of your chemicals would have evaporated. That comes with the process of making that oil or liquid product that you will be selling. So as a result, it's unavoidable. It is You can't avoid it. It is part and parcel of your process. Okay, so that's normal loss. Whereas abnormal loss, it's something that you can control. It is avoidable. So in instances, if you have, let's say, fast food and load shedding happens, they tell us the times as to when load shedding will happen. When load shedding happens, you can avoid cutting off that whole production, closing off your shops by doing what? Getting a generator. You can plan ahead to mitigate you from closing those doors and people not coming to buy food. I'm making an example. So here they're saying that a normal loss in a manufacturing or production process, it's when the quality of your raw material, what you went and buy, it's inferior. You could have avoided buying cheap and inferior raw materials by just sticking to what is quality so that you don't waste when you are producing a shirt or a dress. I'm making an example. Or when you use people who are not skilled to use that machine, right? You have a machine, you know that you have to make this dress, but you hire people who don't know or who don't have the skill set to use the machine. What's going to happen? Going to have a lot of waste. That's abnormal loss. So that's the difference between the two. Okay. So here they say that in your course that you're studying now, they refer losses as wastage, spillage, spoilage, scrapped items. So sometimes in your questions, they're not going to say normal losses. Instead, they will use a synonym to say wastage, spillage, spoilage, or scrapped items. So do not cram and say, yo, but there was no normal loss. They didn't indicate. The synonyms that they use to describe a normal loss. So just be alert and be aware of that, all right? There's something that I wanted to mention there. Cool. So now we will look at input versus output and how normal loss play a role, or what's the implications once.
So can I just take 2 steps back? You know, when you spoke about spillage and wastage, right? Yeah, just that when you were there, would then spillage would be something that you cannot avoid, right? Whereas spoiling is something that can definitely be avoided. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that, yeah. Yeah, so spillage, something overflows, right? Or leaks. Spoilage, something gets rotten. But then wouldn't we say that, let's say with vegetables and fruits,
True.
naturally they might get rotten. What
They
can
might
you do?
get rotten.
Yeah.
And that is not anybody's negligence.
It's
in that regard.
nature.
Yeah. But I guess we'll cross the bridge when we get there, if we get there, right?
Yeah. Remember on that quantity inputs and there's the output portion. So right now, you say that the textbook says outputs could now eat units completed and transferred. We all know that. And this includes your opening width and your current production. This is where your inventory valuation method will affect, especially how you treat your opening width and your units that you started and completed in the current period, right? So now, having this loss topic, under your outputs, you will now also include normal and abnormal loss. That's something that's different because the other part was this units completed and transferred and your closing width. Now there's two things that we add, which is normal loss and abnormal loss. I was saying that part of the output column of the quantity statement, we are now including normal loss and abnormal loss over and above the units completed, transferred, and the closing width. The total input into the process should still agree to the total output from the process, including these losses. Just something to bear in mind, that at the end, they all need to balance. So now, we are now going to look at normal loss, right? Wastage, which is it's another word for loss, for normal loss. As to how do you calculate it inside the quantity statement? Because we have to include it as part of your output column. It's important to note that there's a difference between where the normal loss occurs and how much, meaning quantity or size of the normal wastage is. So remember, as to the position or stage where the normal loss occurs, and you need to quantify how much that normal wastage is, because they both influence how you calculate your total normal loss. But do not confuse the two concepts. So what I'm saying is that normal wastage, in order for you to calculate it, you need to know where it occurred and how much of it, meaning the size. So let's look at some of the rules. Wastage could occur at any stage of the following production process. So it can happen at the beginning. Remember I said where. It can happen at the beginning where the process is 0%, meaning from the very beginning, there's a spillage in your material that you just added already. It can also happen at the end where the process is 100% complete. This is when sometimes there's quality inspections. If you know how they make biscuits, can make biscuits from the beginning. You mix your dough, all your ingredients. I mean, you mix your ingredients, they make your dough, go inside the oven. Then thereafter, once you got the biscuits, there's an inspection that occurs that tests the quality. Because you don't want your customer to be buying broken biscuits, right? If they are in a box, whether they are traveling from Cape Town to Johannesburg, they need to be intact. So it does happen that at the very end of your biscuits, after you have baked them, you find that there's a normal loss. So that's an example of at the end of the process. And another stage where it could have occurred, it's during the process. This is between your 0% and 100% completion. This is, for instance, where you apply heat or you're compressing your chemicals, things might happen in terms of chemicals evaporating, because that could be during the process before you produce that liquid or oil that you will be selling to your customers. So always remember that there's different stages in which normal loss can occur, either at the beginning, at the end, or during the process. Because it's the where part that's also important for you to calculate it, right? So wastage is identified at wastage point. So all I've been explaining here, the where part, when you have identified as to where this loss occurs, that's what we call a wastage point. Everyone understanding the where part? Can I continue to the how much, the size? Right. The how much is a percentage estimate as to what size the normal loss is. And it's expressed as percentages of units that passed this wastage point. So remember, you firstly identify where the normal loss occurs. So for you to know how much, you need to see an estimate of the size of your normal loss for each and every single unit that passed that wastage point. You will see as we do an example. And it has to be for this current period. Okay. So, as I've mentioned, the wastage point is very important because that's when you will see which units passed that wastage point, right? Because there's no use in you trying to look at the ones that came after the wastage point. Unless if there's another normal loss coming before it's completed. But really important wastage point. After wastage point, you will be able to use that 10% that someone was making as an example, not to say it's always 10%, to apply and quantify out of the units that pass this wastage point, which ones, how much of the normal loss did we experience? Okay, so that's where and how. So let's see what they say. For those studying MAC2601, the calculation of normal loss for insertion into output will not differ between first in, first out, and weighted average inventory valuation. So for lucky you guys, you won't be able, you're not gonna, your normal loss calculation will be the same, whether you use first in, first out or weighted average valuation, which is great for now. But as you go to the other stage of MAC, yeah, best believe it's coming. Sorry. All right, so let's determine the rules. I did say that we're gonna look at the rules of normal loss. We're still under normal loss. So rule number 1. To determine the unit subject to normal loss, we always start at the input column. What did we start with, right? We will then apply the following rules to determine your normal loss for the current period. So rule number 1 says, if percentage of completion for your opening WIP is greater than or equal to the wastage point percentage, you must deduct the opening WIP from the input total. If the percentage of completion of your opening WIP, what you came with from the previous period, if their percentage completion is about, let's say, 30%, that 30%, if it's greater than or equal to the wastage point percentage, then you deduct your opening WIP from the input. We will see an example that speaks about this rule. Rule number 2, if the percentage of completion for your closing WIP is smaller than the wastage point percentage, you deduct your closing WIP unit from the input column. Very important that you know this by heart. Okay. So just bear in mind The other one, it says
So
if
rule
it's
number
great-
16.1. Sorry, ma'am. Please go back to rule number 16.1 again. Thank you.
So it's saying if your opening WIP percentage is greater than or equal to the wastage percentage, you deduct your opening WIP from your input column. If number 2 says if closing WIP is smaller than the wastage point, you deduct the closing WIP from the input total. All good. The following are the possible results when we apply 16.1 and 2. Only opening WIP it's either your opening WIP will be deducted from the input or your closing will be deducted from your input total. Neither opening or closing WIPs are deducted, or neither of them are deducted from there, or both of them are deducted at the same time. So at the end, it's either you deduct them or you don't. Or it's an either or. Right? Easy to understand, right? So let's calculate it. Let's determine the normal loss for the specific period, and let's see how much of it will it be. So let's look at an example. So if normal loss is estimated, remember it's an estimated percentage, it's estimated 10% of the units that passed or reached that wastage point. We will multiply the total number of the units that are subject to normal loss by that 10% to arrive the normal loss in units, right? So, and then that normal loss is the one that you will include in your output column in your quantity statement. So let's look at it as an example. So here we've got Can of Worms Pty Limited, an organization that prepares a mixture used for fishing bait. A single process applies and they're using process costing. So they prepare this mixture. Let's see. The units that we've given here, we've got opening WIP, 40% of it is completed, 90,000 units. Then we've got new units that come into production, 200,000. And our closing WIP, it's 30% completed. Your normal loss is estimated 10% of the units that pass the wastage point. So question 1 comes into place. So let's talk about it and then we'll look at the solution together later. What would be your normal loss if, here are the scenarios. Number 1, wastage occurs at the beginning of the process. What would be your normal loss if wastage happens at the beginning of the process? I'm asking. What do you guys think? Can you apply the rules that we look at? Hello?
Hi.
Yes.
The normal loss is estimated at 10% of the units that have passed the wastage point. I'm just trying to see when was the wastage point. Okay, 10%. So it's past the 10%, so you'll have to deduct it.
Remember, 10% is the size,
Ah.
but the wastage point, it's at the beginning.
So the opening WIP it will be deducted by that wastage point if it's at the beginning. Hello?
Hi, I think we're going to say 40 minus 10. And it will give us 30.
Okay. You'll say 40 minus 10.
Yeah, minus 10%, and then we'll get the 30%. That's the wastage occurs at the beginning of the process.
Correct.
And then I'm listening. And
Hello.
what would you do? What would you do with that 30%? Hello?
Hello.
I would have to,
No, wait, hang on. If it's at 40%, that means your wastage, it's past your wastage point here. So your wastage is included in that 40%. So you'll bring your opening WIP as is.
Okay. All right.
Sorry, you can't hear you. You're breaking up.
Oh,
That's much better.
okay. Let me just go closer to the door. So let's look at A, right? You firstly need to calculate your physical input into the process. And to calculate it, you'll say, this is my opening WIP. This is what I put into production. Right? Your total is 290. So let's look at this figure. When the process, the wastage occurs at the beginning of the process. Wastage point happens where there's 0% here. Your opening WIP, it's 40% in, 40% complete, right?
Mm.
And your closing is 30%.
So it's past that point.
So you ask yourself, opening WIP, is it greater than the wastage point? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you keep or do you deduct? You deduct it, because that's rule number 1, right? Okay. Closing WIP is 30% complete. Is it less than the wastage point? No.
No, it's greater.
Do you keep it or do you deduct? You keep it.
Mm.
So, which units are subject to loss? So you take that 290, then you deduct what you said you will deduct based on the rule. Then thereafter, you apply the size, which is the 10%. Are we following this frame of work? How you must think of it?
yeah,
Does it make
yes,
sense?
absolutely.
Cool. So I'm happy with that.
I think I'm still lost.
All right. Where are you lost?
Okay.
One more time, madam. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry to jump into your
Okay.
mouth.
This is how I understand it, is that if your wastage point is at the beginning of the process, right?
Yeah.
And your opening WIP as past that 0%, it's at 30%.
40.
Sorry, it's at 40%. So which means it would have been taken care of during the last year's process or last month's process. So you do not deduct wastage from it because it's past that process.
But what you're saying is correct, because already you took it out. Do you see? You didn't include. If you think about it.
Yes.
Because what we're trying to do here is to determine units that are subject to loss. So with this rule, what this rule means is that if the opening WIP has passed the wastage point, it's not going to be part and parcel of units, that are subject to the loss, because you will deduct them.
You'll deduct the WIP.
The opening WIP, because that's what you did here. We deducted
Exactly.
that WIP.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes. So do you understand why normal loss was not applicable to the opening WIP?
Okay, let me explain why the students get confused. You're saying, okay, when they say deduct the 90,000, which is the opening WIP, students think you got to deduct the wastage point, and that's where our
No.
confusion comes from.
Okay, let's
I don't know
define
if everybody agrees with me or not.
I do.
No,
All right.
I do agree.
I
as well.
agree.
All right,
Yeah.
let's
I'm a bit
start.
Now that
confused.
you say it, yes.
Let's start again. There's wastage point and there's the normal loss size. There's two things. What I'm hearing is that you guys are combining the two. So wastage point is where the normal loss occurred. Right?
Yes.
So wastage point, if it's at the beginning, that means that it happened at 0%.
Yes.
However, there's still the normal loss size. That is the 10%. The rules that we were looking at says that in terms of opening WIP, is it greater than or equal the wastage point, not normal loss size, but the wastage point.
Yes.
So opening WIP was 40% complete. It still has 60 to go in order for it to
Ma'am,
be
your network is I. We can't hear what you say.
I can hear her.
The network is
I
bad.
also can hear her.
I can hear her.
Me too.
I can hear.
Ma'am, your network.
I think
No,
it's
madam.
your
I think
I
it's
think it's
your
only
network
you.
because we can hear it.
It's
We can
your
hear it,
network.
madam. That's fine.
Can you,
She's
ma'am?
fine.
Fine.
Madam, you're fine,
Really,
ma'am.
carry
You're
on.
okay. Yes, you can carry on.
Okay, thank you. All right. Maybe it's load shedding. Load shedding sometimes. If you are currently load shed, the network might be. All right. So okay, cool. So opening WIP is 40% complete. Where is the wastage point? It happened at 0%. So that means that it is greater than 0%. As a result of that, the rule says that it's either you keep it or you deduct. Because it is greater than the wastage point, you deduct it from the input total, which is this 290.
Ah, okay. Now I see it.
Can I also suggest something? Because I think it's quite confusing when we just hear the deduct and the keep, and if we don't have a practical example of, let's say, if we go back to maybe the example of the biscuits and the end process where wastage maybe happens at the beginning or at the end, and then we get the illustration of those deducting and the keeping of the opening inventory, closing inventory. If we can have maybe practical examples based on that, I think it
So
would be much clearer.
well, yeah, it's fine. So let's know. Well, okay, same. Okay, fine. Let's say this. Same. We'll use the numbers here, but I'll try use a practical example. So here they tell us wastage is at the beginning of the process. We've got 90,000 units, which are coming from the previous process. We've got 200 that are put into the current period and current production. So let's use an example of coffee beans. You want to make coffee. Let's stick to the coffee example. So in this scenario, remember the coffee beans, they come in raw, and then now you have to heat them up, like roast the beans, right? So that's process number 1. We roasted our beans. And then the current process that we are in now, we have to ground those beans. Cool? I hope you guys are following. So as a result of that, the opening whip, these are the roasted coffee beans. Now, they are 40% complete. They're coming into the process where now we are grounding them. Okay? So the question comes in, at the beginning of grounding these coffee beans, it happens that, sometimes when you ground something, granules, you start losing those granules, right? So that's spillage. So it's happening at the very beginning of this grounding process. Question comes, all right, you said that you've got 290,000 beans. Your opening whip, it's 40% complete. Is it greater than this 0% where you were grounding them? Yes, it is greater than the 0%. Then they ask, do you keep or do you deduct it from what you said you have as part of your input, which is 290,000 beans? I deduct it, right? So it's 200 minus the 90,000. Then, as part of that grounding process happening, we're looking now at closing whip. It's 30% complete. And closing whip has 40,000 beans. Is it less than or greater than the whip? It is less than. I mean, not the whip, the wastage point. It is, no, it's not less than, sorry. The 30%, is it less than the 0%? No, it's not. So as a result, you keep it, you don't deduct it from this 290. So as a result of that, when we're looking at all of this, out of the 290,000 beans that you had, which ones are subject to the loss? It's the 290 minus the 290. It gives you 200,000. Out of those 200,000 beans, which ones are subject to spillage? It's 10% multiplied by that 200, and my normal loss is 20,000. Does it make sense?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. I
it
think
does. It
you'll have
does, but
to-
I have a simpler way of understanding it.
Okay.
If they tell me my wastage point is at the beginning of the process, then like this question say, okay, I say, okay, it's past the beginning 0. So if my opening whip is X amount, that or X value, it's past that stage because it happened at the beginning of the process. So it will be exempt from wastage because it already happened in the prior period, right? So
it's already far into the process, so it won't be part of the spillage.
Exactly.
It's already past it. But you just have to ask yourself, is it greater than your wastage point? Because remember, we said normal loss is experienced on units that passed the wastage point. Meaning they were coming from somewhere, and they passed, not the ones that are added after the wastage point.
Exactly. So let's take the same scenario.
But it's only on, it's only on opening whip, hey?
Yes, only opening whip. the current production will be subject to wastage point because
Yes,
it's
at the
put
beginning.
into the current period. So that's the distinction I made. Okay, so let's put it into hypotheticals. Take a hypothetical scenario. Say if it was 50% and your opening WIP is 40%. So your opening WIP hasn't passed that stage of
It
completion.
hasn't.
So then you bring it into
Bring the
account, and that
subject.
fully 290,000 units will be subject to wastage calculation.
Let's look at, there's another scenario that we're going to now that will show that, but are we all understanding when this scenario where the loss happened at the beginning?
Sorry, ma'am. Yes, I understand with the opening WIP that is greater than the wastage point, the 40%. I'm just a bit confused with the 30%, the closing WIP.
The closing,
Why?
Yes, same scenario. They're saying the closing WIP, is it less than, meaning is it before the wastage point? Remember this one, when they're saying greater than, it's coming from another process. I think that's why they're saying that it's greater than, it's coming from another process. Probably when it's greater than, does it pass
It's
the
passed.
wastage point? If it did pass, that means that it's not going to be subject to loss.
Yes.
So in this case, our wastage point is the 10% or the 0%?
It's zero. Wastage point is zero. It's where 10% is how much. It's how much the loss would be. Normal loss is into two. Wastage point is where, so there's a percentage for where the normal loss happened, meaning when they were grounding those coffee beans, where did the spillage happen? Did it happen at the beginning, or was it during, or was it at the end? But there's a percentage attached to where. After you've determined that it's at the beginning when they're grounding these coffee beans, there's spillage, meaning there's certain granules that are falling on the floor. It's happening at 0%. Okay,
Can I help here, ma'am?
And then, yeah, I'll just go. Let me just close it. Then they'll ask you, how much of the beans are we going to lose from them?
1,000 was the opening WIP. So after 200,000 that was put into production, or 290 was the opening WIP. So the remainder 200,000 was subject to the 10% wastage point, which was the 20,000.
Not 10%. Remember, 200 is sub 200,000 is subject to loss, but you must ask how much is the 200,000.
10%.
Yeah, say the loss, not the wastage point.
No, the loss was to 20,000.
Yes.
Then out of the 200,000, they were 30%, or how much was that closing WIP? Sorry, of
30%.
30%. 30%. No, what was the value of the closing WIP? Do we know?
40,000.
40,000 out of that 200,000 was closing WIP. So you can see that 200,000 has passed the wastage point, and out of that there was 40,000 units still work in progress, but it passed the wastage point. That is why you will not calculate a loss on the closing WIP. Make sense?
Yeah, so you must know that there's wastage point 0% and normal loss percentage being 10%.
Correct.
Yes, I understand now. I understand.
The 10% is how much? Wastage point is where. This 0% is where. So let's look at another example.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sharp. I think you guys were confusing between wastage point and normal loss percentage.
Yeah, I
Then,
think that
Yeah.
distinction was
yes,
very
you have to
important
distinguish the two.
of the wastage point and the normal loss.
Yes, so let's look at scenario 2. I'm not going to do at the end. I'll see scenario 2 saying wastage occurs when the process is 50% complete. Let's look at that one. Sorry. It is C. Sorry. Cool. So now, this is the beginning, 0%. The end is 100%. Same units, same percentages. Wastage point where it's happening, it's 50%. When you're 50% into the production, the normal loss happens here. So let's start. How many units did you start this process with? I started with 290,000. 90,000 coming from opening WIP, and what was put into the production being 200,000. All right. Was your opening WIP before the wastage point? Yes, it was. Right? So, meaning, is it greater than this 50%? No, it's not. Therefore, it will have to experience this normal loss, right? Hence, we keep it. We're not deducting, we are keeping it. Right. Closing WIP, 30% into the production. Is it before the wastage point? Yes, it is. It's less than the wastage point. So as a result, it will experience. You have to deduct it, sorry. You have to deduct it. So they say that you must deduct it from your inputs. That's the rule. So it's 40,000 less. So what's subject to the loss? It's the 290
minus the 40.
40, not the 90,000. So as a result, you apply 10% here on this 250. Are we all understanding?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we do.
So,
Can you
ma'am,
just please
if
repeat on the closing WIP?
Closing WIP, when it's less than, where am I now? Sorry. Oh,
50% on.
I'm trying to check page. But you understand the opening
page
WIP, right?
258.
Yes. Thank you. Here it is. Here, the closing WIP, it's less than the wastage point being 50%. 30 is less than 50%. So you have to deduct. If it was more than the opening WIP, you keep. So you deduct it from the input. Input being 290 minus 40, you are left with 250,000 units that are subject to loss. How much would be that loss? 10% multiplied by 250 gives me 25,000. At 35%. Still, how much did I start this production? I started with 290 units. My opening WIP is 40%. Is it greater than this 35%? Yes, it is.
Yes.
Meaning it's after the wastage point, not before. So do I keep it or do I deduct? You deduct. It's not going to experience this loss. Okay. Closing WIP. Is it less than or greater than the 35%? It is less than. And if it's less than, you deduct it from the input. So you take 290 minus the 90,000 minus the 40. I'm remaining with 160,000 units that are subject to the loss, then I ask myself, how much of these units will we lose? Is 16,000 units.
So what we're saying is that because it's at 30% closing WIP, it didn't pass the 35%. That is why you cannot calculate the loss on that 40,000 rand.
Yep. Any questions? Yeah.
I think the tutorial will make more sense when we start doing practical work, like applying ourselves in our minds and understanding what is actually is required of us.
What is required of you is understanding the rules of saying that when I have a normal loss, I have to start by looking at how many units did I start this process with?
Yes.
So I have an opening WIP. Okay, so I do. How many units were put into this production? Then they tell me in total about 290,000 units that are going to go through this process. My question comes out of my opening WIP. Okay, wait, where in this process, where did I experience the loss? Was it at the beginning, or was it during, or was it at the end? If it's during, right, I have to look at my opening WIP. Did it pass? Did it come after the wastage point, or was it before? Then you will know as to, do you deduct it or do you keep it to experience this loss? Okay. Then the closing WIP, was it before or was it after this wastage point? Then you will know whether to keep it or deduct it from the units that will experience this loss. After you determine, because all we're doing is just to determine which units are going to experience this loss, then after that, I want to know how many units am I going to lose. That's when you apply the 10%. So you need to learn the rules, understand them, be able to draw your graph. Because this graph or diagram, very important so that you can contextualize it. Draw it for yourself so that you can be able to see as to where within this process did we experience loss. I know that I need to determine units that are subject to the loss and then identify how many of these units am I going to lose within this process. That's all we're trying to resolve. And this is over and above what you know in terms of process costing, how it works. We just want to see how much of these units are we going to lose. That's all we're solving here. It's just that when it comes to the opening WIP and the closing WIP, you need to understand the rules of saying, do I keep it or do I deduct it? We'll do a question.
I have a question, ma'am. So if we look at this graph, I just want to understand it. So I understand what you're saying with the 15% and the 30%. So basically, with the wastage point at 25%, does that mean I will just have wastage or spoilage at 25% or from 25% and onward? Because in my mind, in my mind, I see the 30% as past that 25% already. That's why I don't understand why I should keep that 30%.
So But you understand the opening with portion.
Yes, I understand the opening whip clearly. Yes.
So the trouble comes with the
closing whip. Yes. Even with the even with the first two examples as well, I saw both the 30% and the 40% as past the wastage point. But we just kept the one, we kept the opening, and then we deducted the closing. But I saw both of those percentages as past the wastage point. In the first example, for example, I saw both of them as past that. I couldn't understand why the 40% is past, but not the 30%, because I see both of them as greater than the wastage point in those examples. But maybe I'll just have a look at the recording again.
Okay. There was some student who explained it nicely. Is it Magdalene? As to with the opening word, right? I'm just trying to see what better way to explain it so that you understand. So, in the spirit of saying that we are trying to determine units that are subject to this normal loss, with the opening word, you have to check, did it come before the wastage point?
Yes,
if
yes.
Before, which is in this instance, it came before the grounding of those coffee beans. That means that it will be subject to this law. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that's 100%. I understand that. It's just the
So
closing.
as a result, you will keep it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Then, with the closing word, you guys can correct me here. It's inverse. It's the inverse. Did it come after the wastage point? If it did, you don't deduct it from the input. You keep it.
Can I maybe, it's a completely different way of thinking about it, but I think about it in terms of we've got 100 kilometers race. So let's say, for instance, that Miss Magdalene represents the closing whip. So she ended her marathon on the 30-kilometer mark. I have to start my marathon on the 15-kilometer mark, but our wastage point, or let's call it a water point, is at 25-kilometer. I am starting before the wastage point. So that's why my opening whip I have to keep, because I still have to pass that point. Where Miss Magdalene she's already past that. She stopped at 30% or 30 kilometers. So that's why we have to, in this case, we have to keep her value as well, because she is past that point. So that's why both of our amounts have to, so it depends on where you stop. If you stop before the wastage point, or if you start your process, your whip before the wastage point.
It's a before and after situation, and see how do you treat the two parties who are running this one. Are we making sense with the practical example?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Salma.
I think I'd say go back, yes, the encoding and also the example, and maybe come up with an example for yourself.
Yeah, I'll do that. Thank you.
Because with my example, I understand that because Magdalene understands running. Someone would come up with baking, but make it so practical that you don't cram the rules, because it will get you out. Make sure that you understand it in a way where Even if it's 3 a.m. in the morning, I wake you up, you'll be able to.
Now I get it.
Cool. Others, are you guys fine? Or you will also make an example for yourself? And the more you practice these questions, it's the more it will stick.
Yeah.
I think basically if you understand the rules, then you'll be able to do
Apply.
these questions, to apply them.
Yeah. Okay. Let's look at 16.2. And there's still rules around first in, first out, guys. So normal loss is a bit tricky, but it's possible. Fine. Let's look at normal loss calculation ratio of spoiled items. Okay. The following information is available for Coughless Pty Limited, a pharmaceutical company that produces cough syrup. Just the cough syrup that we drink. The opening whip that comes from the previous process comes into this production 15% completed with 10,000 units.
Yes.
Then, in this process this year, we put in 22,000 units. And our closing working process is 30% completed. Normal loss information that you are given here is saying 4 out of 5 units that reach the wastage point are unspoiled and acceptable for quality.
4 out of every 5.
4 of every 5 units that reach the wastage point are unspoiled and are of quality. Loss takes place when the process is 25%.
25%.
So the 4 out of every 5 units is the size, right? And the wastage point is the 25%. They ask you to calculate the normal loss. As usual, always start with how many units am I starting this process with? It's your WIP and what you put into the production. So it's 32,000. Now you're calculating the normal loss percentage, size of the loss. If 4 out of every 5 units are unspoiled, it means that 5 minus 4 is 1. 1 out of every 5 units will be lost due to normal wastage. Therefore, 1 over 5 multiplied by 100, it is 20%. Any questions on that?
That is spoiled units, right? 20% spoiled units.
When you say point units, what do you mean?
Spoiled, that's the value.
Yes, that's the percentage, not value. It's the percentage of
the
yes.
number of units.
Yes, that if number of units that you have determined to be subject to loss, 20% of them, you're going to lose them. So yes, I had to determine how many units am I starting this process of making this cough next year. It's 32,000 units. Number 2, where does this wastage point happen? 25% of this process. I'm good. But they didn't give me the percentage of the normal loss. I had to calculate it. And to calculate it, I had to take into account the ratio that they were telling me, that 4 out of every 5 units remains unspoiled. That means that 5 minus 4 equals to 1. That 1 over 5 gives me the size of my normal loss. Like what would be spoiled? Are we on the same page?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Then
We're
we start
good.
calculating the normal loss. So I've got three things. I've got the wastage point, I've got the normal loss size now, and I know where my loss is happening. You start with the diagram. 0% is the beginning, 100% is at the end. My opening WIP, it is 15% completed, so I put it there. Closing WIP, 30%. My wastage point, it is 25%. Same story begins in terms of your rules. Was my opening WIP before or after the wastage point? In this instance, it was before. So as a result, it has to be subject to this loss. I keep it. My closing WIP, was it before or after this wastage point? It was after. So you're not going to deduct it from here, you keep it. So all the units that you started the process with will be subject to loss. And it's the 32,000 multiplied by the 20%, therefore 6,400 units, you're going to lose them. Happiness. Rules are the same. The only difference in this example, you had to calculate your normal loss percentage. You had to estimate it. You are not given. The last time it was 10%. In this scenario, you had to calculate an estimation size as to what is that percentage of my normal loss. You had to calculate it in this instance. But the rules and the scenario similar to the ones that we've covered. It's just this part that was different. Any questions?
There's a hand up.
Okay, I can't see.
I just want to ask now, with this calculation of the normal loss percentage, will they always give us the, like they give this scenario in if 4 out of 5 units were, so they will give us the sentence say that out of that is unspoiled and then you need to calculate. Will they give it like that to us in the exam?
Yes, you wouldn't thumb suck it out of nowhere.
Okay.
They will give you a scenario to work the percentage split. Sometimes in questions, they give you the normal loss percentage. In some instances like this one, you have to calculate the size of the normal loss. Don't be in such a situation where you're saying that it's 25%, because we did determine that it's two different things.
Yes.
So yes, they will give you a scenario for you to calculate this percentage.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Are we good on the same page?
Can I just share something? In regards to us determining the percentage of the, if you understand the concept of recapitalization of shares, for instance, I think it's MAC2602, then you can understand what is required of you in terms of determining that percentage. Because in recapitalization, you want the number of shares, but they won't tell you what is the number of shares that is required. But they will say probably 1 out of every 5 shares. So obviously, you know it's going to be 1 over 5. And then you will get your percentage, basically. If you understand that concept, then you are good to go with this one.
Thank you. And remember, it's not always going to be like this, right? It's going to be a different scenario, but to your point, you need to be able to do a ratio to determine the percentage of your normal loss. Cool.
Ma'am, just to ask, let's say, for example, your wastage point is greater than both your opening WIP and your closing WIP.
So 50%.
Will that ever be a case?
Yeah, we did cover it. Let's go. Here it was. It was the 50% one.
Okay.
Your opening WIP, it's 40%, so it's before this.
Yes, so it will
So
have
you had to
stay.
keep it because it was going to be subject to this loss.
Mhm.
And the 30% was before this 50%. So you had to take it out. It was the deduction part, because that's the rule. If it's less than this, if it is before the wastage point,
Okay.
you deduct.
All right. Now I see. Okay.
Okay. The bit of theory, guys, today. Sorry. But I think it's better that we do the theory. Make sure that you understand before we do the questions. Okay. Please follow me. Now we are doing first in, first out implications on normal loss. So it was very important that we spend as much time as we did on understanding how to calculate normal loss, because we're building up on it. So those are the basic principle as to how to view and calculate your normal loss. Let's now see what happens when we value our inventory under first in, first out. So remember at the beginning, we did say that the calculation of your normal loss in units will not differ regardless of whether you're using first in, first out or weighted average valuation. The normal loss influence the first in, first out quantity statement in terms of the units completed from opening WIP based on the percentage of completion. Okay, so let's see what they mean. So they're saying that if the opening WIP has already passed the wastage point in the previous period, this would mean that the normal loss on this unit has already been accounted for in the past. So they're saying that in the previous process, your opening WIP already experienced the loss. You have to take that into consideration. The units in opening WIP that was included in your current period are therefore already net that normal loss. So meaning, if in the previous process, my opening WIP that I'm starting my process with came in at 40,000, you have to remember that this 40,000 might be net of this loss, meaning they would have taken that 10% already from the previous process, right? So in the output column, the units completed from WIP will therefore be equal to the units carried forward. It's a mouthful. So let's continue. It's still theory until you see an example. So I'll still speak the theory, but please we'll look at the example so that it makes sense. However, if the opening WIP will only be passing the wastage point in the current period, the units completed from the opening inventory will be less than. Okay, because they would be subject to the loss. In other words, if we include, remember the rule number one was that if the opening WIP was before the wastage point, we keep it so that it becomes subject to the loss. So if we do keep it, we will have to decrease these units by the normal loss percentage in order to avoid double accounting. So if you think about it, normal loss on incomplete units that we started the period with have not been brought into account in the past, because they only went through loss in this period. When they pass the wastage point this year, they will have a normal loss. Let's continue. So what is the story in terms of first in, first out? The rule. If your percentage of completion of your opening WIP is smaller than the wastage point, you're going to reduce your opening WIP by this loss. So if your opening WIP is before the wastage point, yes, you will calculate your normal loss how we did. You will have to reduce your opening inventory by this loss. So let's look at an example. Here's your opening WIP. Scenario 1, percentage of completion is 60%, 60% completed. And then the units that we are dealing with, it's 150,000. Your wastage point occurs where the process is 45% complete. And it's estimated that, and is estimated as 15% of units that reach this point. When we apply scenario 1, you ask yourself, is the 60% smaller than this 45%? It's a no. That means that it is already after the wastage point, right? Therefore, you don't reduce your opening inventory by the normal loss. Makes sense, right? Because that means that this opening WIP probably has already experienced loss in their previous process. So you don't want a double account. Okay, let's look at scenario 2. Your opening WIP is 20%. The number of units that we're dealing with is 320,000. Still, your normal loss is 45%. I mean, not normal loss, so your wastage point happens. So loss happens at 45% of this process. And they give you that your estimated loss would be 8%. In this instance, your opening WIP is before the wastage point, meaning it will be subject to the loss. So as a result, this is how you deal with it. You say, is the 20% smaller than the 45? Yes. Therefore, that means that under first in, first out, I need to reduce my opening inventory with this normal loss. Right? So how would you calculate your normal loss on this 320? You'll say 8 over 100, 8%, multiply by the 320. So your normal loss is 25,600. These are the number of units that you're going to lose. So you have to show that you've lost them. It's 320 minus 25,600. So your opening inventory will now be 294 as opposed to 320. Are we all understanding of the two scenarios that we looked at and the rule of normal loss when it comes to first in, first out? I'm asking a question. Are we all understanding the rule? And it's very important. It's under first in, first out.
Sorry. On the equivalent units table, which means that we will reflect that loss, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay. That was normal loss. We still need to look at abnormal. Okay. I think the question that we were meant to do today, we might have to do it as homework, but we'll look at the time. Let's see. Yeah, I think I'm going to give it as homework. Because a lot. Okay, cool. I just need to make sure that we all are. Let's look at the time. But we've got an hour. Oh, it's actually 30 minutes. I'm thinking that today I started at 7, so we're ending off at 1:30. So yeah, definitely I'll give the question as homework, and then we will discuss it in our next class. Plus, you guys will need to go over the examples again, make sure that you understand before you attend the question. I wouldn't want you to waste the question. So now, that was normal loss. So maybe let's recap. We know that with the normal loss, there's two things. I need to understand where the normal loss occurs and how much of the units would I be losing. I understand that I need to take into account the number of units that are going through this whole process at the beginning. What are my inputs? I need to take into consideration my opening WIP and my closing WIP. I have to ask myself, was it before or was it after? Was my opening WIP before or after this wastage point? If it is before, I will keep it. I mean, I will deduct. Sorry, no, I will keep it. Now I'm also. I'll keep it because it's subject to the loss. But if it is after that wastage point, I will have to it's deduct, right? I have to deduct. Yes, I will have to deduct. Sorry. If it's after, if it's before, I will deduct. If it's before, sorry. If it is before, it will have to experience the subject loss. So that means I will keep it. If it is after, then I will have to deduct it. Yes, correct. And the opening WIP, was it before or was it after? If it is before, I will keep that closing WIP. And if it's after this wastage point, I will deduct it. Okay. Then thereafter, I have to take into account first in, first out rule to say that this opening WIP, if it is before the wastage point, that means that it is bound to experience its loss. Therefore, I will calculate the loss that I will experience and then deduct it from this opening. If it's the other way around, I don't have to do anything. So those are the most important points that you have to remember. Give yourself practical examples so that you don't lose touch with the principles. Make it make sense, okay, to yourself. Because with me, I have to think, oh yes, I have to make it, because of the example that I've made, coffee beans, it makes it easier for me to know what's what. So now, abnormal loss, we did say that this is what you can control, this is avoidable. So abnormal loss, it forms part of your output column of your quantity statement. And it's actually a balancing figure. And how do you calculate it? So we know that your output will be equal to your input, right? So the total that you have, you must less your units that are completed and transferred. You have to less the normal loss in units, and you have to less your closing WIP. That's how you calculate your abnormal. Pretty much straightforward, right?
Practice.
Yeah, but don't be worried too much, guys. If you practice, you'll be fine. So in some questions, they might provide you with the number of units spoiled owing to abnormal, and the units that are completed and transferred might be the balancing figure. So it's either they will be in the question, they will give you the units transferred and completed, or they might give you the abnormal loss. So yes, this is how you determine it, but you must look what are you provided with in the question. Then you will know which one would be your balancing figure. Either it's your unit completed or transferred, or it's your abnormal loss. Okay. Another scenario might arise where two types of abnormal losses are there. There's one type of abnormal loss caused by a specific event, like power failure. This might be at any point in the process. And the other time, they might give you a scenario where your abnormal loss occurs at the same wastage point as the normal loss. Okay, so just be alert of that. So let's see here. Your abnormal loss, if it's okay, cool. If the abnormal loss results into a negative number, there's actually an abnormal gain from the process. The treatment of the abnormal gain will be covered in other modules. If you arrive at an abnormal gain within this unit, you should know that you made an error somewhere. So it's something that you must be alert of. So if you're making a gain, just know that you did your calcs otherwise. That's the hint of you're on the off the rail. So fine, something just to bear in mind. Then determining your equivalent units of normal loss and abnormal. These are the general guidelines. They tell you about raw material conversion cost. Then we can do an example of your quantity statement. Okay, for the purpose of this course, raw materials will always be added at the beginning. In other words, your material will be added at the process where conversion process is present. We've spoken about that before. And when material is added at the beginning of the process and any wastage point occurs at any stage of the process, this means that all the material that you added for the purpose of wasted units will effectively be wasted. So your normal loss and your abnormal loss, the equivalent unit percentage is always going to be 100% for raw materials. There's two more rules. Conversion costs. Conversion cost will be lost due to wastage, right? To the extent that it has taken place at that point in time when wastage happened. So for this course regarding conversion cost, it will be the percentage of the conversion work, so the percentage of completion. Abnormal loss, you will use the wastage point percentage if conversion is taken evenly. Okay, so you take the percentage as is, what they tell you, because everything is happening evenly. It's not a point where labor is there, machinery overheads is at another point. So if the question does not state at what stage the abnormal loss occurred, you must assume it's at the same wastage point as your normal loss. We'll do an example that I'm talking about here. So the rule is as follows. There's two rules. So rule number one, wastage point is where the normal loss and abnormal loss takes place. Rule number 5, if your abnormal loss and your normal loss takes place at a different place, you need to see where it is in terms of, we are now talking about percentage of completion. because there's still those rules. Remember at the beginning when we are doing equivalent units. So you always have to take into account where your wastage point is. There's instances where your normal loss and abnormal will happen at the same time. And there's instances where they are split. So just be alert as to where the wastage point is. That's what they say. I just want to look at it as an example. Let's look at 16.3. And then, yeah, let's look at 16.3. And then we'd have closed process costing. And please do not be thrown off by losses. It's just two things that you're adding to equivalent statement. The build up, like I said. So let's see it now in a quantity statement, this losses that we've been calculating. So Luna Lotion manufactures body lotion, and it's a single process. Raw materials added at the beginning. Conversion takes place at the same throughout the process. Normal loss is estimated to be 15% of your inputs that reach that wastage point. Cost of production figures are as follows. Your opening WIP, you see sometimes they don't say opening WIP, you'll just see 1st of Feb. So that's your opening, it's at the beginning. It is 30% complete, 2,000 units. What they've put into this process this month is 23,000 units. And what they completed is 16,000 units. And at the end, you see, they just give you a date instead of saying closing WIP. It is 60% complete and it's 4,000 units. So they ask you to prepare quantity statement according to weighted average and first in, first out if all wastage occurred at the beginning of the process. So you start drawing that graph. So it's at 0%, the first scenario that we work with. But now you have to take into account there's first in, first out, and there's weighted average. So let's look at the two. That's 0%, your wastage point, but your normal loss calculation is 15% of units. So you start saying, what did I start this process with? I've got my opening WIP, and then I've got what was put into production. So I've got 25,000. Your output, this is the weighted average also, right? Because remember, now you must also remember other rules of inventory valuation. So under outputs, you've got completed and transferred. Completed and transferred is 16,000. Because remember, under weighted average, you don't split them, right? You don't split between opening and what was put into the production. You don't do that. You just put it as it is, 16,000. Your normal loss, that's where now we start that whole process of scenario. We started with 25,000 units. You ask yourself, was the opening WIP percentage more than or equal your wastage point? It was more than. So you have to deduct that 2,000. There it is. My closing WIP, was it less than my wastage point? And in this instance, it was more. Therefore, you keep it. So 25,000 minus the 2,000 multiplied by that 15% gives you your normal loss.
Now we
Closing.
can see it into perspective.
Yeah. Zona, do you want to present or? Okay. Now you see it, right?
Yeah, I'm trying not to remove this thing. Yeah. Sorry about that. You can cancel that. Thank you.
Then they ask you your closing WIP. Your closing WIP is given, so you put it there as part of your output. Now, remember, we did say that if you are given that completed and transferred, your balancing figure will be your abnormal loss. How do you do it? You say 25,000 less, right? It's all those things that we spoke about. Then you calculate, then you get your balancing figure, and that becomes your abnormal loss. Are we happy with the output? Are you guys following?
Yeah, I think when it's put into context of this physical and equivalent units, then it makes sense.
It does, right?
It does. It all comes together. But when you do it in isolation, I think it's a bit gray. But when you put it into context, because now you can see you're completed and transferred, obviously it's all has to go through that wastage point, etc., and your closing WIP and your opening WIP. So it all comes into perspective.
It does. You just had to understand how to calculate, because if you just throw it into this quantity statement, sometimes you would just be cramming calculations. But one thing at a time, it ends up fitting into what you are used to. So you are correct. It now will make sense. Then here, equivalent units, you have to look, okay, fine, my completed will be 100%, conversion cost would be 100%, normal loss at 100% in terms, remember they said raw materials, they will all be at 100%. But then the conversion at the beginning, it's 0%. It's only opening WIP where you have to show it like that. Now I want to see first in, first out. Let's see with first in, first out. Weighted average, straightforward. But now, with the first in, first out, you must always remember, find input, we know, 25,000. You have to split it now. You must show your opening WIP. You must show your current production. Normal loss calculation will be the same. It's just that your abnormal loss would be different, right? Because balancing figure will be otherwise. Let's see. And your closing WIP would be the same. So number 2 says.
Okay, with the FIFO, your current production actually becomes like a kind of a balancing figure between completed and transferred and your opening inventory.
Yes, that's what it becomes. And you must remember your conversion costs, you take into account the remainder of what still needs to happen. So it's 70%. And this one is the same. I'm taking silence as no questions. I just wanted us to look at this one. So this was when the wastage point was at the beginning, right? So now if wastage is at 70%, how different would it be? I'm interested in first in, first out. Let's look at the first in, first out, right? I'm just bearing my time, because this is where now we have to apply that rule around deducting the normal loss out of your opening WIP. Remember, your input would still be the same, 25,000, but then your opening WIP, you have to now take into consideration the whole rule of first in, first out when it comes to normal loss. So they tell you here, because the percentage of conversions of your WIP is 30%, which is smaller than the wastage point, you have to show that it was before the wastage point. Wastage point is 70, and your opening WIP came in as 30, so it was before that point. So it's obvious that it will go through this loss. So as a result, what you put in your output would be your 2,000 minus this 15% of units. So it's 1.7. And as a result, let's try to see how different your conversion point will be. It's the very 1.7 that you put there times the 70%. So you're not going to say 2,000 multiplied by 70%. And you also have to show the point at which your normal loss happened here on your conversion costs. Just something that's different in terms of first in, first out.